let's start with kind of what made you do this. I mean, I often say, I think we said that, sometimes founders do things because they just see messy processes that they're like, hey, I can build something. My experiences show me this is messed up. I can go build something that'll make a difference. Maybe talk about what experiences led you to start to build Papaya.
Sure. So in my background, I established two services companies. Both of them are dealing with global workforce and global mobility. But I mean, on local markets, one of them was based in Israel, serving the region. And afterwards, I started a business in China and expanded to the continent. And in both companies, I saw the need of clients to expand globally and to find an immediate solution when they need to hire and to manage things. The experience from all parties was terrible. I mean, we always felt that they're asking too many questions. They don't understand anything. The data for them was not clear because every single location was different. And it was very inefficient, untransparent. And eventually, I think that when we calculate this, we realize that for every employee that they hire overseas, they spend about 20x time than a local employee. So in reality, I mean, you always think, do I need this employee? And then I was just envisioning how we can make it completely different and how we can bring technology to eventually create a much better experience. And this is where we started with Papaya.
Gotcha. Talk about what is it, that 20 times thing? What was that? Say that again, 20 times more.
It means
hassle?
that if you need to hire someone on a different territory where you don't understand the labor laws, you don't understand the data that you receive, you don't know how to read payslip and so on, you'll spend in average 20x time than managing every single other employee that you have on your payroll.
Got it.
So, I mean, you can have 100 employees in the US that you're going to run payroll, and then you have those 5 people in China that will take you the same time to manage every single month. This is, I mean, crazy amount of time.
Gotcha. That makes super that was super clear. Actually, that really kind of made it, and it intuitively makes sense. I mean, as I think about our companies and when they start to grow, you just head hurts, right? And then, of course, kind of building on that, and what Finn mentioned earlier is, remote and global is hard, and then suddenly you have COVID last year, and which suddenly was a huge trend pushing for remote work. So there's a great Satya quote of 2 years digital transformation in 2 months, and in one sense it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. It definitely happened. So maybe talk about what you saw in COVID in the last 12 months, both in your business and probably more interestingly in your customers, and what they were doing and how that impacted their appetite for remote and distributed work.
Yes. So even before remote and distributed work, eventually payroll is a core part of every organization. If you're not gonna be paid, I mean, you're gonna leave.
Yes.
No one is saying this because he likes the company. Eventually, we expect to be paid on time. And when COVID started, we suddenly started to realize that companies are taking payroll for granted, but it's a very complex process. You need to do it every single month. You need to collect lots of data. There are tons of variables that change, tons of regulation, compliance, and so on. And we just realized that companies are starting to get panicked because every single employee has this 1 or 2 person that is doing the payroll for everyone. And if he all of a sudden is not available, nobody can replace him. That's kind of crazy when you think about it, which you have a contingency plan for everything. And then for payroll, you have this person that, I mean, you trust. So it was a very interesting dialogue for us because when we started speaking with organization, and this was always our approach, we told them, you need to have access to the data. You need to be able to have a contingency plan for your payroll. So this was the first thing that we saw when COVID started and everybody was kind of panicking and nobody knew what's going to happen. They didn't spoke about growth. They were just speaking, how do I pay my employees around the world? This person is not available. What do I do tomorrow morning? I need them to get paid correctly. I need them to get paid on time. Nobody cares about COVID. They still want the salary to be on time in their bank. And then as COVID started, we started speaking about growth, and growth is an interesting thing because why growth happens? It happens because all of a sudden you cannot travel any longer. So we saw countries like Australia, for example, that still locked. I mean, still closed for travels, and all of a sudden the rise that we saw of employment in Australia grew this year in more than 500%, which is crazy. But if you cannot have people traveling from Singapore or from Thailand to Australia to support clients, you need to hire locals. And so you need to set up new entities or new locations that you have people on ground to support your clients, to support main locations. And then I think that the third part of COVID was the fact that we started to do hyper growth, right? Because everything accelerated. So then, okay, it doesn't matter. We don't have any offices. Everybody works from home. So let's assure that, so let's hire them globally. We don't mind where they are. So this was kind of those three things that we saw over this year that eventually we were very busy serving and eventually kind of speak a lot to the vision that we had when we started Papaya.
Super helpful. And, obviously having made the investment in you guys and heard you give this pitch, I think the first one you mentioned is actually one that took me a while to internalize, but I think is really important. It's the whole idea that forget the impact of COVID in terms of hiring people and where they hire. And we'll talk about remote and distributed work next time. Your big picture point is, payroll is a vitally important business process, and international payroll in particular isn't run like a business process, wasn't run like a business process. It's kind of this cottage industry of stuff happening. And COVID exposed that. And a whole bunch of people realized, I can't run this way, right? And that actually was a point you made to me during our investment process. And as I say, it wasn't obvious, but the minute you said it, it's like, yeah, it makes sense. And yeah. I think it's a key part of our thesis. And so maybe...
And also payroll is the biggest expense in your company. So you want to be in control. So, eventually you want to assure that you understand the data. This was also a perspective that we saw in COVID, because we did some companies that were under pressure to reduce costs. A lot of our clients from travel industry and so on, and the ability for them to have accessibility to the data, understanding where they can reduce cost on a real-time basis was very helpful for them.
Totally. No, an integrated headcount view, because, as you say, if half of your employees are some kind of subcontractual basis, then you have the expense, but you don't have the visibility unless you have a system that can deal with that. And we'll actually come back to the kind of the Papaya offering in a second, not just make the whole mini commercial. But let's talk about distributed teams. And, how do you think founders should think about distributed teams? I mean, you mentioned, earlier in a piece you wrote that they need to have a construct, not just, wander willy-nilly into having a distributed team. And, questions you said, what's the team's activity? Yeah, before you hire someone in another country, what's the team's activity? What's your commitment? How large is your workforce? How do you tell kind of founders and CEOs to think about, globally distributed teams, and what are the issues?
Okay, so I think that in general, everybody needs to keep in mind that hiring people from different territories, different geos, is complex. Okay, it's like putting 10 different people that speaks 10 different languages in the room. The conversation will not going to be easy. So, and compliance never gets easier. Payroll is always getting more complex. And when I'm advising to people, I'm telling them to think about a few factors. First, do you really need a person in a specific location? If this is your business need, like we said in Australia, this is your business need. That's the end of the discussion. If this is not the case, think about, is this location is the right location for scale, and also for eventually for the ongoing management. For example, labor laws in the Netherlands and France and China are very difficult and tricky, and employment cost is very expensive. If you are looking for a place for scale, if you know that you're going to have quite a lot of retention of churn in your employees, that fits those criteria and makes sense. So think about what you are trying to hire and what you are trying to achieve. And third, there is always this talent. If you need a specific talent and you don't care wherever he is, you don't care wherever he is, that's great. But just have this strategy, because it's very easy and very tempting to say, oh, I'm going to hire people remotely. And then all of a sudden you understand that you have liability to 30 countries. You understand that you need to run those taxes and so on in many, many places. And sometimes there is no business logic to it.
Interesting. So it's almost like an anti-commercial. Don't do this unless you really want to. It's hard, right, for the product, yeah? And it's interesting. And when you think about your customers, and this is just from a distance, is implicitly what you're saying there is most of the time the story is, I do need them in this space, or I am being very intentional about it. I could have envisaged a world where, with remote work in the last 12 months, if I don't care if my employees are in California and I don't mind they're in Austin, do I really mind that they're in New York, or sorry, in Italy, or in Kazakhstan, right? So kind of an unintentional drift to remote work. And just because, let's call it international remote work. Once I acquiesced in, remote work in my geo, then maybe I just don't care internationally. And that's one thread. And then, as you say, the other thread is the intentional, I can't get to Australia, so I'm just going to have to hire people in Australia. And how are you seeing that mix? I mean, are people, adding one or two engineers in all sorts of different places internationally, or is it more intentional?
So we saw people basically adding a lot of team where they have business activities and they understand that flight is not, I mean, they need to kind of think of a day where flight is not an option. So you need people on ground. That was the very, very first thing. We saw also a lot of companies, and a lot of our clients are hyper growth clients. So, hiring people and ensuring that they can grow and meet their clients' needs and scale is very, very important. So we saw them looking or sourcing for locations where they create groups. Now, I'm not, I mean, I always say that I'm not in love on like remote models as a complete total model. I think people should meet. I think eventually meeting people in person, even if it's, partially, even if it's once a month, makes a lot of difference. So obviously it's also make it much easier if you build like groups of people around specific countries and not have a total chaos of things. And another thing that I think that people tend to forget is time zone. This tricky thing now, it's 5 a.m. in your morning time. It's the middle of the day.
I am well aware that it's 5 a.m. That's why I look rough and unshaven. Exactly. And you're smooth and well turned out there. You're winning. Exactly.
So, and it's important because those things can impact the ability to set a meeting from today to tomorrow, or to set it for a week from today, because it's tricky for everyone. And then you'll have this group that wakes up very early in the morning, or the one that that stays up at night in order to make it. So it's not sustainable as well. You need to assure that eventually you think about those factors. This is very important.
Interesting. Got it. No, that makes sense. And what's interesting about the two kinds that I can't travel, so we have to get people there, is one is kind of a globalization isn't doable. I can't fly in, and the other is it doesn't matter where you are. Globalization is everywhere. It's kind of an odd. It just, I think, shows that the last 12 months have mixed up everything. And one of my theories is, no one knows jack about what's going to happen. The last 12 months is proof.
I agree, but I actually read a very interesting survey a few days ago that shows that eventually, if you are a salesperson, so in reality, currently you said, okay, if you are selling over Zoom, so you don't meet the client face to face, it doesn't matter who is on the other side of the line, right? But they actually showed that local to local works much better. So even if I want to sell to the Italian market, if I'm gonna play someone from Germany, it's gonna work less good than having two Italians speak over Zoom. So we are a global world, but localization is very important.
Totally, and that's exactly it. It's not a one-dimensional story, and and the interesting thing is sometimes it doesn't matter where you are story benefits Papaya, and sometimes I want someone locally think benefits Papaya, because as you say, if my customers are in Italy, I need an Italian at some point, right? And if I'm an American company, I need to hire them there. So let's talk about kind of what Papaya does, because look, we've been around 3 or 4 years. People have been hired internationally for way years before that. So talk about what's the delta you bring to the process? What do you typically find before you come in, and what does Papaya do on top of that makes it better?
When we started Papaya and I was looking at the market, I saw that it's very fragmented. You have payroll company, you have ER providers, and you have contractor solution. But eventually, when every company that I ask have, a best of breed of all type of workers around the world, and the ability to manage it efficiently when you have so many data streams, so many even softwares, but eventually, this only do those group of employees and so on, is very, very complex. And the first thing that we did when we envisioned Papaya, we said, okay, we want to create a total workforce system, because we don't care how you employ the employee. This is the reality. This is a compliance issue. We will obviously support this, but we want to ensure that the data and everything is being consolidated into one system. The other thing that we said, we want to take it to the SaaS world, because currently when we were looking on systems and technology, they were aiming to thousands of employees. But in reality, every startup in your portfolio, every startup currently, every company have remote workforce. So, I mean, we want to assure that it's becoming an accessible tool, not when you have thousands of employees and it's completely chaos already, but from the very early days. And we also believe that eventually companies currently are much easier to adopt SaaS platforms than going through a very lengthy and long implementation process, which was also very important when we designed Papaya. We really wanted to be global, because when we were looking on global solution, they were always focusing on the 10 biggest markets. And then the rest of the world was kind of out there. But in reality, the rest of the world is, I mean, even if I have 2 employees per country currently, the rest of the world is kind of big in terms of the need to serve it. And if I look from the other side, we were always wanted to also bring the expertise, because we don't sell system. We sell a solution to clients to assure that they can consolidate, but they can also have the trust that they do it correctly, that they hire everywhere correctly. And in many cases, we are, when we start speaking with our clients, because global payroll is still a greenfield, it's almost like the revolution from IT to DevOps from our perspective. So you need to explain them what they know, what they don't know, and they need to know how to plan and build a global strategy. You know, I mean, US clients will come and say, oh, we have unlimited PTO, we want to bring like health benefits and so on. But we need to take this and translate it country per country, and to assure that we can adapt it locally to the regulation. It's always, I mean, we are trying to keep a global framework, but it's always going to be very, very localized.
Got it. No, lots to unpick in that. So, I mean, one of the things is, you know, going back to the process, what I've often found, and, you know, you see it here is, yeah, how much businesses, especially as they grow, are prepared to pay for kind of the boring structure and control part of things. It's like, because, you know, I wrestle an issue when we talk, it's like, well, they're paying them already, it's all working, right? And the answer is, at some level, they are being paid already. But if I'm the CFO of a large American company and I have structure and processes for every part of my business, and then 1/3 of my workforce is ex-US, and I have 10 local service providers doing payroll and no way of aggregating it, you know, you suddenly realize that's a huge vulnerability in your process. And it's, you know, 1/3 of your biggest expense, and you simply don't have a clue, and you wire money to an accounting firm in, you know, Warsaw who disperses it somehow, and you've no control. And this idea that building this layer that allows them to control it very much resonated with me. And I think I often say to people that sometimes you have these business processes that sound fairly trivial, but when you imagine yourself, as I always say, the CFO signing off legally in a public company that I got this under control and I'm putting my ass on the line, for lack of a better word, you want a process like this. So I think Papaya, that was definitely something. And how did you know, what kind of drove you to realize that? Was it your experience, or how did you get to that?
So I think it was a lot of my experience and kind of previous analysis that we took, and kind of assumptions that we went and tested in the market. But one of the most interesting conversation that we had with a very large company, publicly traded company, and they told us, you know, in reality, we spent last year $100 million on workforce, but we can allocate only $70 million to that. I mean, we don't know where the $30 other million went to. We know that it's part of the payroll, but we don't know if it's expenses. We don't know it's overtime. We don't know if it's benefit. We cannot allocate this sum. Now, going and making and going backwards and stepping into the details, it's almost impossible. This is so small details. From their perspective, it was almost coming from 50 different countries. And this is where it makes us realize, when we were kind of thinking about what market Papaya will serve, what type of clients, I mean, where eventually we can step in, that this is a very, very big problem. Because if you don't have this data on a real-time basis, if you cannot answer in a real-time basis how many people works for you globally and what's the total workforce cost, if you don't know it now, you'll never know it. You don't, I mean, maybe in like 6 months, you'll know what happened 6 months before, but it's not relevant any longer.
Got it. No, that totally makes sense. And yes, the idea that you can have a bunch of spreadsheets and you can have people run around and aggregate. I mean, it's astonishing that if you can't allocate your expense, you can't manage your company. So yeah, totally. That's a side. And then, but you also have the other side of that you also mentioned. This is why this is a complex business, but be a huge opportunity. You have the overall management. And then, as you say, you have this massive pile of data for each individual company you work with. And obviously Papaya works with individual providers. How do you stay on top of all that data? I mean, a company, one of the big things, the opportunity here is by definition, almost a company can. If I'm this, again, I put myself in the mind of the customer. I'm the CFO of a fast expanding software company in the US. I got US labor laws dialed. I'm now in 20 other countries. I just don't know, right? I mean, how do you as a firm stay on top of that and make sure you can give them top-notch information on where they want to be?
So we spend with Papaya to build the compliance country per country, to understand the data, to break it, to map it. I mean, for example, in the US, you're going to use 401k as a pension funds. In Israel, we're going to use managers insurance. In Australia, you're going to use superannuation. Eventually, you need to map those, you need to categorize those, you need to understand the rules behind it. And obviously, I mean, that's constantly changing. Unfortunately, our client eventually are the governments. The product managers of Papaya are the government. And they're not they're not a really good clients to have, because they can change things from today to tomorrow, break everything that we build in terms of governance and so on, and we need to start over. But obviously, this is our business. This is the problems that we have, and this is our headache to solve. But once we mapped all of the countries, and once we have the process, I mean, we can really bring technology into the space, and not just consolidating data and hand over a file from China in Chinese and from Brazil in Portuguese and so on, but really build this, I mean, from scratch to be correctly. So we use a lot of AI, we use a lot of automation processes. We use our compliance engine to identify things that are basically discrepancies in the data, because I mean, it's crazy, but it's still manual work. I mean, people spend hours and hours and hours every single payroll cycle on this. And I mean, this is a frustrating work, and you need to replace it.
Gotcha. No, I mean, at the risk of going into sell mode, what I always tell, folks that you're trying to recruit when I get to talk to them is, the hugeness of the opportunity here is, in the US, we have ADP, Paychecks, Workday, and a bunch of, they're all of which are, 100 billion plus companies, and a bunch of $5 and $10 billion companies. And international payroll, in other words, the other 75% of the world's GDP, less whatever local providers there are, is just pretty much untouched. There are no similar companies, and there's no offering a service for international, and that's the kind of huge opportunity here. I think you're seeing, and frankly, a bunch of other companies are also seeing and entering. So I think it's an enormous market. That's why we're so excited to be invested. So talk about where the world is going. I mean, I shouldn't say I hate that future of work quote, because at one point we use that as our tagline, but it's definitely overused at this stage. So we moved on, but it is. Pre-COVID, it was kind of a buzzword. Now it's actually an open question. We were just chatting about it before the session started. Where do you think distributed work is going? I mean, we're starting to come out of COVID. Please God, some of us are not going to go back to COVID. But how do you think what are you seeing that impact your customers, and what are they thinking about the world post-COVID at this stage?
So I think there are lots of open questions currently. I think that we were kind of quick to declare that very fundamental changes will happen, and the world will not gonna go back to normal just a minute after COVID. But in reality, people, I mean, just hopped on flights when on the first opportunity they had, and they're opening up new offices and so on. But I think that people kind of asking themselves, what's the right way to go back? And I think everybody I understood that eventually we need to create a no paperwork environment in everything that we are doing. We need to have system to support everything. This is kind of a good opportunity to get rid of. Hybrid models will probably be out there much more frequently. And I do believe that we will continue to see distributed workforce. But I think that a lot of companies were kind of rushing to hire all over the world and have this open remote policy and so on. And I mean, this is taking a lot of work, a lot of energy from the organization. And I think that eventually it will balance. I mean, it will never be 50%, never say never, okay? But this is my own personal thinking. You will not see 50% of the companies becoming totally remote, fully remote. And we need also to keep in mind that countries are not making it easier. So immigration is always a tricky thing. So if I have this dream that I want to be a digital nomad working from all over, I mean, doesn't mean that I can do that, because in reality, I need work permit, I need sponsor to this work permit, I need to pay taxes somewhere. So there is this romance feeling of COVID, but also there is reality and kind of the compliance aspect of how do you make it reality.
Makes sense. And I think, two things he said there that resonate. The first is that comment that, people have been quick to declare. One of my big conclusions from this has been, it's humbling how little we know, right? It was humbling, and how our confident prognostications at every stage in the journey have been utterly and absolutely wrong. Look, I thought I would never wire $25 million to someone I'd never met in person. I wired it to you, right? And it felt weird for a while. It's like, but you move on and you adapt to that. And then at the same time, your certainty level that, we're going to do this forever. You're exactly right. The minute the other option comes back, you kind of go, well, I don't know, right? I mean, my opinion on what will work is literally changing by the month. So I think you're exactly right. Being kind of tempered in this is good. But the other thing, and you also said it, is because when you get in these discussions with people, even if it isn't going to go to all that for whatever that thing is, it's clearly not going to go back 100%, which by definition, the most important thing we do, which is what we do, where we work and how we work, has changed significantly. Even if it's, if it's a 20% change, that's huge. I mean, if 20% of the workforce are going to be in a different place or a different country or have to be somewhere else, that's just a huge secular shift. It doesn't have to all change to make it happen. I mean, I think that's...
But there is a dark side to it as well, because, I mean, when you are starting to look on people, and sometimes I see some kind of hiring campaigns, you can work from all over, you can stay on the beach and work. And I said, no, I mean, you need to have you are working with secure data and so on.
Totally.
I mean, and we will start seeing, and we see it, I mean, already in some stories and so on, much more frauds, much more attempts to hack to companies. Obviously, we are in the payroll business. So, I mean, part of the core components that we have in Papaya is to assure that we can protect everything that is related to global payments and to take everything that is manual effects from there. But we saw kind of simple, sophisticated yet simple frauds this year from people that hacking, for example, salary files from one of the municipalities in the US, and just replacing the bank account details of all of the employees. And all of a sudden you wired $20 million to the wrong bank account without even know. So I think that there is also a dark side to this globalization and remote things of having eventually someone that you don't know connecting to your organization, connecting to your softwares, or being able, to work on unsecured environment, which I think that we should not forget. I mean, this will rise. We will see more cases. Companies will be affected more and more by things that they cannot protect. I mean, because an office you can protect, right? Quite nicely and quickly. And you are kind of breaking everything that you build to protect the organization.
That makes sense. No, totally. And I think that it's a step. The trend is real, but like most everything tends to add complexity. And frankly, for you guys as the people who manage it, complexity is a business opportunity, because businesses want to buy software that just makes it easy to manage large distributed companies. And the bigger the problem, the more the spend, because the more willingness to say, I can't let this just run along unchecked. And so I got to manage it.